Okay. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second webinar organized by the Warsaw Ghetto Museum. Today, we're fortunate to have Professor Michael Berenbaum of the American Jewish University who speak with us about forms of resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Professor Berenbaum and his work, I'll give you a few biographical details. Professor Berenbaum is a scholar, an author, a filmmaker who specializes in the study of the Holocaust. He served as the Deputy Director of the President's Commission on the Holocaust and is the Project Director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, where he played a leading role in the creation of the institution. He was also the Director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Research Institute and is currently Director of the Sigi Ziering Institute at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles, California. He is the author and editor of 18 books and is the executive editor of the New Encyclopedia Judaism. Professor Berenbaum is also a founding partner of Berenbaum Jacobs Associates, which is a firm which deals with designing museums, special exhibitions, and educational centers. The professor has contributed to the Warsaw Ghetto Museum project for several years, initially reviewing and contributing to the scenario for the permanent exhibition, and since last year has played a more prominent role as an advisor to the overall development of the Warsaw Ghetto Museum permanent exhibition. So I'd like to invite now Professor Berenbaum to give his presentation, and afterwards we'll have time for questions for whoever wants. Professor Berenbaum.
Thank you very much, David Berman. I'm pleased to be with you. Good afternoon for those. Good afternoon or early evening for those of you in Warsaw, and good morning for those on the West Coast. Good afternoon for those who are elsewhere, and it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. Let me give you an overall picture of the forms of resistance and then talk in particular about resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto. There's a Swiss historian by the name of Werner Rings who says that in every country in occupied Europe, in German occupied Europe, in every country, there were three forms of resistance that took place before armed resistance. And those three forms we can say are symbolic and personal resistance, polemical resistance, defensive resistance. Let me define them and let's understand that. Polemical resistance is easy to understand. Polemical resistance is when you oppose the Nazis by word, you oppose them by writing, you oppose them by verbs, you oppose them in a variety of different ways, even with humor. And we'll talk about that in a very basic way, even with graffiti. That is polemical resistance. Defensive resistance is the individual and the organized attempts to aid, to protect, and to rescue. That also is fairly easy to understand. It is self-help. And symbolic and personal resistance is the way in which you resist dehumanization. So you deny the enemy one of the goals, and one of the goals of the enemy was to dehumanize the Jews before they destroyed them, to make them, as it were, into the images that they had with regard to the Jews. And that takes symbolic resistance can take many forms. Symbolic resistance can take the form, for example, of the man who washed his clothes every day in Auschwitz, even though they did not get clean, even though he had to put them on wet, because in a very deep respect, he felt that he wanted to remember a day when he had clean clothes and when he preserved his human dignity. There is an artifact in the Illinois Museum, which is a very interesting artifact because it's an intimate artifact of women's private clothing, a bra that was created out of sackcloth in order to give a woman a certain sense of human dignity. We'll talk of all three of these forms of resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto. Let's first of all look at polemical resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto. Let me give you an example of polemical, and all of these precede armed resistance. Let me give you my favorite example of polemical resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto, which is humor. A child is asked in the Warsaw Ghetto, what would you like most of all if you were Hitler's son? And his answer in Yiddish was, Ich will sein Yosem. I'd like to be an orphan. And you can think many times over, what is a better answer than that? And in a very real sense, there is no better answer than that. In Germany, they told the story of two Jews who are reading a newspaper. One is reading Der Stürmer, the other is reading a Jewish newspaper, when you could have a Jewish newspaper. And Moshe turns to Yaakov and says, Yaakov, how can you read such a thing? And Yaakov says, how can you read such a thing? They look at each other and he says, what do you mean? He said, you read your Jewish newspaper and you hear that today is terrible and tomorrow will be worse. You hear of decree after decree after decree robbing the Jews of human rights, of civil rights. I read Der Stürmer, and all of a sudden I read that Roosevelt is not Roosevelt, Roosevelt is Rosenfeld. I read that Jews are all powerful. Why would I dare read your newspaper to get depressed when I could read my newspaper and feel myself empowered? Humor was one of the tools that the oppressed used. The most famous example of polemical resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto is the work of Immanuel Ringlebloom and the Oneg Shabbos group. And the Oneg Shabbos group, which created essentially an archive, documented the history of the Jewish people in ghettos and in the Warsaw Ghetto in particular, was a tremendous sense of polemical resistance because it wanted to resist not only for this moment, but literally for eternity, because it felt that it did not want the history of the ghetto to be written by the killers. It wanted to provide the raw material for the history of the ghetto to be written by the people inside the ghetto. And they believed in an incredible way, they believed that even if they did not survive, Jewish history would survive, the Jewish people would survive. And they would want to, in the words of Simon Dubnov, they would want to write and record. They would want to understand precisely what happened. And what did Immanuel Ringlebloom do in the Warsaw Ghetto? He gathered writers and historians, poets, musicians, rabbis, doctors, physicians, social scientists, to document the entire history of the Warsaw Ghetto. As the ghetto was being, and they did this clandestinely because they understood that in a very real sense, whoever writes the history tells the story, and they wanted Jews to be able to tell the story even posthumously, even from the grave. And consequently, they offered an opportunity to document and to collect and to understand precisely what happened. That's an example of polemical resistance. Polemical resistance could also be handing out pamphlets. Polemical resistance could be the individuals in the diary in the ghetto who wrote diaries. You know that even Adam Chernyakov kept a diary, a daily journal, which provides us a unique understanding of what his experience was and what was provided during the day. The gathering of information, this is a way to resist the sense of total domination by the oppressor, by the perpetrator, by the killer, which denies the victim any say. I want to establish a principle with you that I think is very important. Just because the Jews were powerless does not mean that they were passive. And that is, Jews use 100 and thousands of different ways in order to what? To bypass the enemy and to, in a very real sense, to deny them the ultimate victory of not only dehumanization, not only destruction, but dehumanization, demoralization, and denial of all basic forms of human dignity. Symbolic and personal resistance becomes critically important as a way of preserving your humanity. Let me give you many examples in the Warsaw Ghetto, and let's understand them in a variety of ways. In the Warsaw Ghetto, there were clandestine schools. In the Warsaw Ghetto, there were clandestine synagogues. People davened. In the Warsaw Ghetto, there was the teaching of Torah. In the Warsaw Ghetto, there were concerts, there were theaters, there were even, as it were, entertainment places, all of them designed to symbolically resist the Nazis by providing the wherewithal, the internal wherewithal, to preserve one's humanity and to maintain one's dignity all the way through. One has to look at that as a very important mechanism by which the victim resists dehumanization. Self-help and defensive resistance is very clear. Let's look at self-help, for example, at the soup kitchens of the Warsaw Ghetto. In a very interesting way, in 1940 and 1941, the soup kitchens were provided for by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee in a very basic way. And then after the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee could not provide services, essentially they were given IOUs, and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee paid the IOUs after the war, and consequently people had an attempt to eat. There is a very famous statement by Rachel Orbach, who wondered as the ghetto came to its most desperate point whether the soup kitchens were actually helping people to live or they merely were prolonging death. In a moment of despair, she did not realize, she did not understand which she was doing and whether she was merely increasing the agony. Another very basic example of self-help were the smugglers. And we understand that from the work of Immanuel Ringlebloom, who said that if you had to give a statue to the hero of the Warsaw Ghetto, it would be a 10-year-old child who went to the other side, who walked into the sewer system and walked to the other side, to the Aryan side, and procured food and consequently provided, I don't even want to say adequate resources, but provided additional resources in order to feed the population. Because if they depended merely on what the Germans were providing, they would not survive. Third example of self-help were the attempts to escape, because escaping to the Aryan side essentially meant that you were denying the Germans the opportunity, the Germans and their assistants, the opportunity to destroy you. You were trying to escape them, and this is a means, an important means of self-help. So let me repeat. Before you went to armed resistance, you had symbolic resistance, polemical resistance, defensive resistance. Now, armed resistance and other forms of resistance were not a matter of courage. Let's take a wonderful example, the stellar example, the magnificent example. Yanis Korczak, who for an American audience was the equivalent of the Mr. Rogers and the Dr. Benjamin Spock, the great pediatrician and the great storyteller, who was respected deeply throughout Poland and who had many people who were his followers, both educationally and even as physicians, reported with his orphanage to the Umschlagplatz. He was offered the opportunity to escape. And he said, then what about the children? And since he could not protect the children, he went with his he went to his death with the children. A father does not abandon his children, a teacher does not abandon his students, a doctor does not abandon his patients. So knowing that he was going to die, he escorted his orphanage to the Umschlagplatz, boarded the train with them, which took the courage and the foreknowledge that he could be a teacher, he could be a doctor, he could be an example, he could be a father to the very last moment, to the very end. There are stories, and we have a recent book on doctors in the Warsaw Ghetto, which was a PhD dissertation, a marvelous PhD dissertation, published both in Poland and now in English as well, which describes the doctors who went with their patients to Treblinka, the doctors who assisted their patients to the very end. We have rabbis who went with their community to the end. There's the wonderful example in Pietrko of Rabbi Lau's father. Rabbi Lau's father did something deeply natural, and that is he hid his family. But he said, if they do not find me, they will search everywhere and they will find other Jews and deport them. So Rabbi Lau, in fact, waited out front for him to be captured. And he said, I will not be a Moser, I will not be somebody who turns fellow Jews over to the enemy and who essentially causes other Jews to die. So he went again to his death. So it's not a matter of courage that leads to armed resistance. Let's talk for a moment about the obstacles to armed resistance. Many Jews did not have military training, and consequently, they didn't naturally and easily and immediately resort to arms. Weapons were difficult to come by, and we understand that the relationship between the Polish underground and the Jewish underground was difficult. Weapons were expensive. They were difficult to come by. The Polish underground was not willing to give Jews weapons because they were afraid that they would not use them, and they had the image of Jews as being passive. Some were anti-Semitic and did not assist, and others, in one sense, wanted to wait before there was an armed uprising. But the timing of an armed uprising for the Poles, for the Polish non-Jews, and for the Jews was different. The timing of the uprising for Jews had to be before the Great Deportation, before the ghetto came to its end, which in the case of Warsaw, we know was 1943. The Warsaw Uprising, the non-ghetto uprising, was only in the August and September of 1944, when the Soviet troops were on the other side of the Vistula River. And essentially when the Poles imagined that they could be self-liberating, and Stalin instead allowed the Germans to destroy the Poles, only then did he destroy the Germans. And consequently, he emerged, as it were, in his own mind, triumphant. So arms were difficult to come by. Military training was lacking. And the other element that made ghettos hesitant to resort to armed resistance was the notion of collective punishment. One could kill, and there would be massive and disproportionate punishment. You might kill hundreds for the act of one, even for the escape of one. And certainly if a German had been killed in action in the ghetto, there would be dire consequences for many within the ghetto. And consequently, there was a hesitation to use armed resistance. When did resistance break out in the Warsaw Ghetto? And this timing is absolutely important, critical for our understanding. Resistance broke out after, armed resistance broke out only after the Great Deportation, and it broke out among certain men and women. And the remarkable thing again in the Warsaw Ghetto was that resistance broke out among men and women. And it broke out at a very certain point. It broke out after there had been the Great Deportation. It broke out when there was knowledge of what Treblinka represented. And I once interviewed Marek Edelman and Simcha Rotem. Simcha Rotem was Katzik. Marek Edelman was one of the last living commanders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, a great physician who was a transplant doctor in Poland, remained in Poland after the war. And they told me the story of Zygmunt Freilich. Zygmunt Freilich was, they understood that there were trains leaving for Treblinka. They didn't understand what was happening in Treblinka. So they sent a man by the name of Zygmunt Freilich. Zygmunt Freilich was a man who had contacts with the Polish unions. He got himself on as an engineer on a train to Treblinka. And then he interviewed the train drivers, and they told the following story: that Jews are arriving daily, every day, that the trains are going out full, they're coming back empty, that no supplies are being delivered to the camp, no wells are being dug, and the camp is remarkably silent, which we now understand the reason Jews are arriving full and the trains are going back empty is because they're being killed there. But he didn't understand that. He then said, how can I tell what's happening? They said, take a deep breath. And the smell of human flesh is burning human flesh is a very distinct smell, and a smell that impacts dramatically and significantly. And even there were reports in New York when you had the burning of the World Trade Center with all of those bodies, that many survivors recalled the smell of the burning of human flesh. Freilich then also met with an escapee from Treblinka who told him what was happening in the camp. He brought that back to a group of young people, and they, in a very real sense, then had knowledge. And with knowledge of death, they understood that the question was not whether you're going to live or die, but the question was twofold: how are you going to live until you die? And secondly, not only how are you going to live until you die, but what statement are you going to make with the fact that you're going to die? And they understood that they could not report to the train, and consequently they began to prepare for resistance. Resistance in that sense came to Warsaw late, came to Warsaw after the Great Deportations of 1942. 1942, between July 23rd and September 21st, on the Jewish calendar between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, at least 265,000 Jews were deported to Treblinka without an act of armed resistance. Only then did the depressed group of young men and young women understand that they had to engage in resistance, and that's the moment at which they came to armed resistance, and that's the moment they began to plan. So in very real respect, and they were also uniquely in a unique situation. After the Great Deportation, After the Great Deportation of 1942, you essentially had mostly young people. You had few children and few elderly. The elderly and the young had been deported. And consequently, you had people who could be only responsible or solely or primarily responsible for themselves. And consequently, they had the choice and the capacity, in one sense, both to risk their lives, but to choose the circumstances under which they would live. Prior to that, many Jews were bound by family ties. It's difficult to imagine a mother leaving her child to join the resistance. It's a little bit less difficult, but not easy to conceive of a father leaving his young children. In the Vilna ghetto, there's the famous story of Abba Kovner. Abba Kovner was the only son of a widowed mother. And when it came time that he was going to leave for the forest, his mother wanted to join him. And he said, "You cannot because you're not a fighter." And she said to him, "Don't leave your widowed mother to die alone." And you have to understand the tremendous tension that creates for a human being. So in the interim, between September 1942 and beginning January of 1943 and culminating in April 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance began. And it began with planning, it began with training, and it began with the notion also that the assurances of the Jewish Council that all you had to do was to go along with the Germans and you would survive. Let me step back and put it this way. Ghettos were a way to contain the Jews until what at the very beginning neither German nor Jew understood. The Jews believed that the ghettos were a place where they would live until Germany lost the war, until Germany came to its senses, until Germany was defeated. And therefore, what they did within the ghetto was to create a life, to shape a life for themselves and to create a life for themselves. Shaping a life thought they had an indefinite period of time. For the Germans, in retrospect, but only in retrospect, only later did we understand what the ghetto represented for the Germans, was a way to isolate, segregate, contain, imprison the Jews until a decision was made as to what to do with the Jews and until the infrastructure was built for their ultimate annihilation, what the Germans called extermination. What was the infrastructure? The death camp. And when did the death camps come along? Death camps came along in late 1941 and 1942. Chelmno, adjacent to Lodz, was opened and began killing on December 8th, 1941. Belzec came on board in February, March 1942. Sobibor in the spring of 1942. Treblinka in the summer of 1942. And then Auschwitz was expanded into Auschwitz-Birkenau with all that represented. So a decision was reached as to, and remember, the Germans began killing. The Germans began killing by sending mobile killers to stationary victims. These were the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killers. They did not operate alone. They operated with the Wehrmacht. They operated with local gendarmerie, and they operated with local gendarmerie, local anti-Semites. And in many different villages, it was the people themselves, the neighbors, who killed their neighbors because they wanted to inherit. What happened in 1941, late 1941, was a decision to reverse the process. This is in many respects what makes the Holocaust sustained, unique, distinct. And that is the process was reversed. Instead of sending mobile killers to stationary victims, the victims were made mobile and they were sent to stationary killing centers. In other words, to factories of death, which combine the idea of Darwin's survival of the fittest with Henry Ford's assembly line process. In other words, they were factories that ultimately produced dead Jews, and we see how enormously successful they were. Belzec killed somewhere between 434,000 to 500,000 Jews, with only 2 known survivors. Sobibor, between 200 and 250,000 Jews were killed, 47 known survivors. Treblinka, somewhere near 925,000 Jews were killed, with less than 100 survivors by the end of the war. So these were factories of death, and consequently the idea was you couldn't get once you understood that, once you knew that, once that was ingrained within you, then only then could you understand why you had to engage in armed resistance, because you have nothing left to lose. There's a famous American folk song by Bob Dylan, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. What happens in this period? There is training, and then you have the event of January 1943. There was an order given by Himmler to weaken, to, as it were, to cleanse, to lessen the burden of the Warsaw Ghetto. And there was a minor deportation. But during the minor deportation, what you had was armed resistance in which some Germans were killed, and the deportation was not complete. The Jewish underground understood that, the Jewish fighting forces understood that that meant that if you confronted the Germans, you had the possibility of surviving. And from then on in, they prepared, and the population supported them, and also prepared for an armed uprising. A terribly sad, divisive, and problematic note. The Jews fielded 2 armies in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The right-wing army and the Labor Zionist and Bund army, the ZZW and the ZOB, because they disagreed about what the future would bring, a future that none of them were likely to live to see, and they couldn't, as it were, come together and field one army, coordinate with each other. And the question then becomes, as the politics change, is who gets credit for the great acts of resistance during the Warsaw Ghetto? Is it the ZZW? Is it the ZOB? No less a figure than Moshe Aarons, former defense minister of Israel, former Israeli ambassador to the United States, wrote a book on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising to give the right-wing Zionists, the Zionists of Beitar, their credit for the uprising, and to take it away from the labor Zionists who had been dominant in the early years of Israel and wanted to take credit for the leadership of Mordechai Anolovitch and his colleagues. Jews even then could not come together. Now, let's go to the shape of the uprising for one moment. And we have to look at the uprising in that sense. The uprising broke out at a very special moment when the Germans had surrounded the ghetto. and they were aided by Ukrainians. Ukrainians who today are heroes were then participants in the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto. And the idea was that the date to be chosen for the ghetto reduction, for the Great Deportation, was going to be April 20th, 1943. It was to be a birthday present for Hitler for his 54th birthday. A present from Himmler would be to destroy, to get rid of, to make the Great Warsaw, this community that was the site of the vibrancy and the vitality, the integrity, the depth, the passion, the diversity of Jewish life, to make Warsaw Judenrein free of Jews. For the Jews, that was an equally special night. That was the first night of Passover. Jews were celebrating the ancient freedom from slavery onto freedom that took place, the exodus that took place from Egypt that night. Ghetto was surrounded. The Germans entered, and then the Jews began to fight. And remarkably enough, spectacularly enough, dramatically enough, the Germans retreated. They came back with a larger force, and ultimately the decision was made in a very dramatic way. The decision was made by the Germans to destroy the ghetto, building by building, block by block, by setting it aflame. The Jews at this point were not reporting for deportation. They had all been planning for hiding places, and they had an underground that could function beneath the surface, but they were smoked out in a very real sense. But the fighting continued day by day, week by week. And on May 16th, 1943, your General Jürgen Strupp set aflame the Klemetska Street Synagogue, the great synagogue of Warsaw, and wrote to his superiors, the Jewish quarters are no longer. Bragging about it, and prepared an incredible document, which is the Struct Report, which gives us the great visualizations of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. From the German perspective, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was an embarrassment. Superman had to flee. These massive soldiers with great arms could not destroy the ghetto, and the ghetto literally held out longer than the Polish army had held out during the initial weeks of the war, longer than the armies of France, and continued to fight and to inflict casualties. And there's a presumption that the list of casualties from Germany that was listed in the Struct Report is inaccurate and understated. But the incredible thing is they had to withdraw, and they could not conquer. They ultimately had to destroy, annihilate, decimate, and murder, and the like. From the Jewish perspective, let's hear it in a very basic way. In the words of Mordechai Analevich, I have lived to see the dream of my lifetime come to realization. A Jewish fighting force has been created, and we Jews were able to make the Germans flee the ghetto. And the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising has become the ultimate symbol of resistance during the Holocaust. The few against the mighty, the weak against the strong, and the depth of passion that it took, commitment that it took, the depth of what was needed in order to rise against the Germans was enormously respected, and it became the ultimate symbol of resistance during the Holocaust. Jews did not expect to live, And in fact, one of the debates between the right wing and the left wing was whether there should be an escape plan. And most Jews expected to die within days, within hours, but they didn't. And then essentially the question became, what do you do? And then some Jews were able to escape through the sewers. And you have to understand, escaping through the sewers meant that you were willing to walk into feces and urine and all of those hard smells in order to get out of the ghetto. And then there's the famous story of Kotzik, who came into the ghetto and thought he was the last Jew, thought he was the last one alive, and found other Jews and took them through the sewers. And there was a truck waiting on the other side, but the truck could not take everyone. The sewers were flooded. The sewers had gas put in them in an attempt to destroy the last remaining Jews. But some Jews fled to the forest, and they were able to continue their fight clandestinely against it. Statistics revealed it was a mismatch. The Jews of Warsaw, probably about 7,000 or 8,000 Jews were killed. Some 40,000 or 50,000 Jews were deported. Not many survived. The Germans lost soldiers, men, materiel, and morale. But on a very deep level, it's not the statistics. It's the courage that it took, the dignity that it took, the audacity that it took to take on the all-powerful German army and to declare essentially that I'm going to fight for my freedom to the last breath. And that's, in a very real respect, what makes the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising so important, and why it becomes the symbol of resistance fighters in other genocides. And we look at it with different eyes today because we have now seen, and we're seeing daily in the Ukraine, the incredible importance of the human capacity to resist. Reb David, let's take some questions, and I will look in the chat and see what questions are there, or you will feed them to me and we will go from there.
First of all, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. And one question that is asked is, did this Warsaw Uprising lead to other uprisings in occupied Poland at the time? For example, in Treblinka or Sobibor, this was something completely unrelated.
Let's remember, this is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, because we have to understand, for those of you who are not comfortable with the nomenclature, the difference between the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the Warsaw Uprising. So the Warsaw Uprising occurs in September and in August and September of 1944. The Ghetto Uprising occurs in April 1943. And if I wasn't clear, the timing of the uprising for the Jews has nothing to do with the war, but everything to do with the Great Deportation. You can't get on the trains. Getting on the trains is death. Now, did it lead? It inspired. And it's clear that it inspired the uprising in Treblinka, and it became a legend. It was passed on, especially through some couriers. And remember, the couriers were women for the most part, because Jewish men were circumcised, Jewish women could pass. And the couriers had to have certain capacities to pass information on. They had to be young. It helped if they were good looking, because good looking women can get out of certain circumstances that others could not. And if it sounds like chauvinism, this was a chauvinistic environment, and you use whatever tools you can. They had to speak Polish fluently without an accent. And they had to also be very careful in the words of Vladka Mead, that their eyes did not betray them. What do you mean their eyes would betray them? Many people had learned to disregard what was happening in the ghettos and to the Jews and pretended not to see. And if your eyes reflected that you were interested, and your eyes reflected that you were pained by what you saw, your eyes could betray your Jewish identity. To answer specifically your question, there were multiple ghetto resistances. There were resistances in 3 death camps that we know of. In Auschwitz, there was a resistance in October 7th, 1944. In Treblinka on August 4th, 1943. And in Sobibor on October 14th, 1943, there was the uprising. All of these occurred when essentially people understood that what was awaiting them was death, and it was now or never. And when they understood that there was a sense, and I am less willing to use the words that they used, because they said we have to die for Jewish honor and with honor. And I think lots of people died with honor if they resisted dehumanization, even by non-lethal means. But this was very important to them. So the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was inspirational within Poland, occupied Poland itself, and inspirational for Jewish history and for human history. And that's why certain words are known, Mil 18, etc., are known. We're asked, could Poles outside the ghetto know what was going on? What was their reaction? Poles outside the ghetto certainly knew what was going on. And we understand this very well. I was close to Vladka Mead of blessed memory. Vladka Mead was on the Polish side as a courier and as an arms purchaser, and she saw the reaction of the Polish population. For some, this was a very significant moment because they never believed the Jews would fight. And all of a sudden, a fighting Jewish force gained honor in the eyes of the Poles. That was the moment at which some within the underground were willing to give the Jews weapons. You have the great poem by Milosz about the Carousel, in which everybody went about their business normally. Some people took their dates to the Carousel while the ghetto was burning on the other side. And in essence, the response of the general Polish population mirrored their attitude toward Jews. Some who were anti-Semites said goodbye, good riddance, they're getting what they wanted. Others who were more democratic, more pluralistic, more tolerant, more open, felt terrible, but they did not have a similar acts of resistance to come to their rescue. So the situation varied, but the Poles certainly knew what was happening. They could see what was happening. They could hear what was happening, and they could smell what was happening. Because remember, when you set an entire ghetto on fire, the smell, the stench, the burning can be seen throughout the city and understood.
Another question is, do you have any particular opinion as to why the military uprising was emphasized in the immediate post-war years, and the spiritual resistance or the human dignity side was neglected?
It's very clear as to why that happened. People want what is called a usable history. A usable history is what can we learn from the past that we can use in the present. Israel in 1947, 48, 49, 50, 51 onward was fighting for its very existence. When the state was, I'll tell a funny story. I once washed dishes with David Ben-Gurion, the founder of Israel. I was on kibbutz, and on kibbutz there was a sense that everybody treated everybody equally. David Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel, the founder of the State of Israel, the George Washington of Israel, was assigned to wash dishes, and he was smiling the entire time. And I walked up to him, and I was an American who spoke Hebrew, and I spoke in those days Ashkenazic Hebrew. So he got a kick out of it. And I said, Mr. Prime Minister, why is it you're smiling? He said, let me tell you a story, young man. He was then in his 70s. I may have been 15, 16 at most. He said, in my life, I never finished anything. If I wash dishes, I work for half an hour, and at the end of a half an hour, I'm finished and it's done. And tomorrow, somebody else will wash dishes. He said, when we founded the State of Israel, everybody else was dancing in the streets, and I was meeting with generals to figure out if we were going to have a State of Israel tomorrow. We were being attacked by 5 armies, so they're all dancing, and I'm worried if they're going to be alive tomorrow. And here I'm washing dishes, and I can, finish, be done, and go home and go to sleep, and it's over. The point being that Israel was fighting for its very existence. So it wanted to say we need to discover physical courage as the way to use our history, and the like. So they approached the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as the example. In fact, Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel is called Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, Holocaust and Resistance Day. And by resistance at that moment, they meant it as armed resistance. And they even had a debate, when do you observe Holocaust Remembrance Day? And the secular Jews wanted to observe it as closely as possible to the actual day of the uprising, but you couldn't celebrate Warsaw Ghetto Resistance Day and the ghetto resistance on Pesach. The messages would have been too confused. So they made it on the day after, the week after Pesach, because it's ironically the one day that cannot occur on Shabbat in the aftermath of Passover. They made it on the 27th of Nisan, which can never occur on Shabbat. So they did that. Over time, people understood that there are multiple forms of courage and integrity that have to be appreciated. And consequently, they came to understand all of the forms of resistance: polemical resistance, symbolic, personal resistance, defensive resistance, self-help, escape. All of these are important forms, and they came to understand, as I tried to express, that courage took many forms, and the different forms of courage were not only the fighters, though we have to give the fighters our respect for the courage that they demonstrated. But again, the doctor who went with his patients, Korchak, the rabbi who went with his community, the teacher who stayed with her students, all of these, the parents that stayed with their children, all of these are forms of courage. All of these are deeply worthy of respect. And we have a more sophisticated history now, a more usable history, as it were.
Okay, thank you very much. I see that we're running out of time. I know that the professor has another appointment soon, but I see that someone was asking, is there any publications you could recommend? It could be English, Polish, or in Hebrew on these subjects that we've been talking about.
There are many. I will leave it to you to give the Polish publications. There's a book called Resistance by It's a book called Resistance by Israel Gutman. In English, there's also a book on the Warsaw Ghetto by Israel Gutman, which is quite terrific. There's Moshe Ahrens's study of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising from the perspective of the ZZW. There is also of course, there's the Diary of Adam Chernyakov. There is also the great diary of Immanuel Ringlebloom. There are the Ringlebloom documents, which all form the basis of the scholarship. There's also a lesser known book called For Your Freedom and Ours, which is a very important book, which deals with the multiple forms of culture, of resistance that we found in the Warsaw Ghetto, and deals with the documents of the Ringlebloom archives. There's also the poetry of the Ringlebloom archives, which is online, and that's the work of Sarah Moskowitz, who translated the Yiddish poetry into Hebrew, and the Yiddish poetry into English, and whose work is very important and very well done.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, for your time, of course. And thank you to all the participants, all our guests, and you're obviously invited to our next web conference, whenever and whatever that will be about. But we thank you all for your participation, and wish everyone a good evening, a good night, whatever the case may be. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.